You stood at the grave after the service. The others had already moved toward the cars, your aunt, your cousin, the people you see at funerals and nowhere else. You stayed. The earth was still disturbed. Not smoothed yet. Not settled. The kind of mound that is still an event rather than a fact. You stood there with the collar of your coat too tight and the sky doing nothing dramatic. Just grey. Just ordinary. A bird flew across and landed somewhere behind you. You had said the prayer. You had meant it. The way you mean things at gravesides that you are not certain of anymore. And somewhere between the first word and the last, a question moved through you. Not a theological question. Not something you could diagram. Just a pulse. Did he really die on that cross? You have never said it aloud. You have never told anyone you thought it. Because the question sounds like a failure. Like something wrong with you. Like the kind of doubt that disqualifies you from the grief you are actually feeling. But you thought it. And the ground was still disturbed. And the sky did nothing for you. And you walked to the car and said nothing. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to start with a verse I have read hundreds of times. Mark chapter 15 verse 44. The scene. Pilate has received word that Jesus is dead. He is preparing to release the body for burial. He calls the centurion. He asks him a direct question. Here is what Mark records. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. Read that again. Pilate, the governor who ordered the crucifixion, the man who had full operational knowledge of Roman execution methods, was surprised. 6 hours on the cross. Standard Roman crucifixion, and this is not disputed in any historical or medical literature, took 3 to 7 days. 3 days at the minimum, 7 at the upper range. Roman execution by crucifixion was designed specifically to take days. The physical trauma was engineered to be slow and public. The prolonged suffering was the deterrent. Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours, and the man who ordered the execution was surprised it was over. That verse is in every Bible, every translation, every edition. It has never been removed. Nobody preaches on it. I spent 12 years teaching early Christianity in a classroom. I can tell you exactly what we covered in the Passion narrative. The Last Supper, Gethsemane, the arrest, the trial before Pilate, the crucifixion. We never stopped on verse 44. We stopped on the women at the tomb. We stopped on the resurrection appearances. We stopped on the Great Commission. We never stopped on the governor's surprise. That single word, surprised, in the canonical record, written by the same tradition that affirms the resurrection. The man who ordered the execution thought it was too fast, and in 2,000 years of Christianity, nobody appears to have asked what that means in physiological terms. I want to take the 6-hour question seriously, not as a believer, not as a skeptic, as someone who spent years teaching people to read historical documents as physical records. Roman crucifixion killed through a combination of processes: cardiac failure from blood loss and oxygen deprivation, hypovolemic shock from the scourging that preceded the cross, dehydration, exposure. In some cases, the breaking of the legs, which prevented the condemned from pushing upward to relieve pressure on the lungs, accelerating suffocation. A man who had been scourged, nailed, and elevated in late spring Palestinian heat, 6 hours would be early. Not impossible, but early enough that the man who knew Roman executions found it unexpected. Now look at the other details the Gospels record around the crucifixion. John chapter 19 verse 34. The soldiers come to break the legs of the 3 crucified men. They find Jesus already unresponsive. One of the soldiers pierces his side with a spear. And the text records, immediately blood and water came out. This detail appears only in John, and it has been the subject of medical debate for decades. The standard explanation offered by the tradition is that this proves death, that the separation of blood and water indicates cardiac rupture or post-mortem fluid accumulation. But several medical researchers, including work published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, have noted a competing physiological interpretation. The pleural cavity can accumulate fluid under severe trauma. Piercing the chest wall in that condition can release fluid that reads as water followed by blood from a heart still at minimal function. This is not proof of survival. I am not presenting it as proof. I am presenting it as a physiological question that has never been answered to the satisfaction of everyone who has looked at it carefully. And then there is Joseph of Arimathea. Mark chapter 15, verse 43. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. He did this immediately. The body was wrapped in fine linen, placed in a tomb cut out of rock. A large stone was rolled in front of the entrance. Hours. From the moment of death declaration to the sealed tomb. Compare that to the other two men crucified alongside Jesus. They were still alive when the soldiers came to break their legs. They were executed on the cross. Their bodies were not claimed immediately. There is no Joseph of Arimathea for them. This is what the canonical record says. A man with connections to the council, to the institutional apparatus of Jerusalem, went immediately to the governor, claimed the body, wrapped it in fine linen and placed it in a private tomb. Within hours. And the tomb was sealed. Now, there is a tomb in Srinagar. The city of Srinagar is the capital of the Kashmir Valley. Old Srinagar sits along the Dal Lake. The Khanyar quarter is in the old city, a narrow alley, old buildings, a place that tourists pass through occasionally on the way to something that appears in guidebooks. In the Khanyar quarter, there is a shrine. It is called Rozabal, sometimes spelled Rozabal. The local name translates as the tomb of the prophet. The tradition surrounding it is not modern. I want to be precise about this because the conversation around the Rozabal shrine often gets immediately framed as a fringe claim, an internet phenomenon, a conspiracy theory. The written record is older than the internet, considerably older. Two independent Kashmiri chronicles document a figure called Yuz Asaf. The first is the Tarikh-e-Kashmir, written between 1579 and 1620. It is a historical chronicle of the Kashmir Valley. The author is a Muslim historian writing about the history of his own region. He had no Christian thesis to defend, no Western audience to impress. He records Yuz Asaf, a prophet of God, traveled to Kashmir from a foreign land. The second is the Waqiat-e-Kashmir, written in 1747 by Khwaja Muhammad Azan Didamari, another Muslim historian, another independent chronicle, another record with no Christian agenda. He records a foreign prophet and prince, Yuz Asaf, came from the west, healed lepers. Two Muslim chroniclers, two independent texts, written 168 years apart, both recording a foreign prophet from the west who came to Kashmir, healed lepers, lived a spiritual life. The tradition they were documenting existed before they wrote about it. They were recording something already present in the local historical memory. Now look at the name itself. Yuz Asaf. In Aramaic, Asa means healed. In Hebrew, Asaf means gathered. Yuz maps linguistically to the Aramaic and Hebrew forms of the name Joshua, which is what the name Jesus is. The name as a whole maps to something like Jesus the healer, or Jesus who gathered the healed. This is not a speculation invented in the 20th century. The linguistics are documented in the scholarly literature on Aramaic and Hebrew etymology. And the tradition about this figure, the foreign prophet from the West, healer of lepers, spiritual life in Kashmir, was documented by Muslim historians who were not making a Christian argument. They were writing their own history, and the figure was already in it. In 1899, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim movement, became the first person to publicly assert that Rozabal is the tomb of Jesus. His thesis, Jesus survived the crucifixion, traveled east through Persia and Afghanistan to India, died in Srinagar at an old age. Mainstream Islam rejected the claim. Secular historians rejected it. The Ahmadiyya movement, which now has tens of millions of members worldwide, accepts it. What matters for this investigation is simpler than the theological dispute. Ghulam Ahmad did not invent the tradition. He found it. The chronicles that document Yuz Asaf were written 200 and 300 years before he was born. He arrived at Rozabal because the trail was already there. Holger Kersten spent years on the ground. That matters to me. I read books written from libraries. I read books written from archives. Kirsten was a German researcher, not a theologian, not an ordained minister with a position to protect. He spent years in Afghanistan, in Persia, in India, in Kashmir, following a geographic and textual trail that others had noted but not mapped in detail. His book, Jesus Lived in India, was first published in German in 1983. He is not a peer-reviewed academic. I hold his work accordingly, but he documented something that is neither invented nor unverifiable. The Rozabal shrine presents three physical anomalies. The first is the burial orientation. Islamic burial tradition orients graves north to south. The body faces Mecca. Every mosque in old Srinagar, every Islamic grave in the Kashmir Valley, north to south. The grave inside Rozabal is oriented east to west. Jewish burial tradition orients the body east to west, the head to the west, the face toward Jerusalem. In an Islamic city, in an Islamic shrine, the grave is in the Jewish orientation. Someone chose that orientation. Why would a Muslim shrine built for a local holy man, even a foreign one, be buried in the Jewish direction? The second anomaly is the stone foot impressions. Inside the shrine, set into the floor, are stone impressions of feet. These are documented in the Persian Chronicle from 1747. They have been photographed. They exist in the physical record. Local tradition identifies marks in those impressions as wounds consistent with crucifixion. I cannot tell you, sitting here in Indiana, what those marks are. No independent forensic team has ever been sent to examine them. That is the point I will return to. The third anomaly is the dual occupant structure. The Islamic records indicate the tomb contains a second figure buried alongside the primary one. The local tradition identifies the second occupant as a companion. This dual occupant structure has a parallel in the Gospel account. John chapter 20 verse 12. Mary Magdalene looks into the empty tomb. She sees two figures in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. I am not presenting this as proof. I am presenting this as a set of anomalies, physical, architectural, textual, that are documented, accessible, and have never been formally investigated. You have been told that the doubt is the problem. That if you had stronger faith, the question would dissolve. That the willingness to ask is itself the failing. But Pilate's surprise is not your doubt, it is in the text. The centurion confirmed death to the governor, and the governor, the man who ordered the execution, was surprised at how fast it was over. You did not invent that. You did not read it into the text. It is Mark chapter 15, verse 44. It has been in every Bible printed in every language since the text was first copied. It was in the Bible your grandmother had on her shelf. It was in the pew Bible at every church you ever attended. Nobody assigned it to you. Nobody explained why Pilate found it unexpected. Nobody stood at a lectern and said, "Here is the question that the governor's surprise raises. Here is why it has never been answered." You are not the first person to stop on that verse. You will not be the last. The question is not faithlessness. It is the most honest thing you can do with a text that records a surprise and never explains it. I want to give Bart Ehrman his full argument, because I think the English-speaking audience I am talking to deserves the honest version. Bart Ehrman is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has written more books for a general audience on the historical Jesus than almost any other scholar working today. He is not a believer. He is a rigorous historian, and he has addressed the survival question directly. His position: the death of Jesus on the cross is, in his words, universally attested. Attested in Mark, in the material unique to Matthew and Luke, in John, in the Gospel of Peter, in Paul's letters, in Hebrews, in Revelation. Multiple independent sources written across different communities and decades, all recording the same death. I have never met a scholar who holds the survival view Ehrman has written. I want to honor that, but I want to draw a careful distinction. Ehrman's argument is from textual attestation. Multiple independent texts all record the death. That is the evidence he is citing. The textual attestation does not engage the 6-hour physiological question. The texts that universally attest the death do not universally attest the speed. And the canonical text, the most universally attested, records the man who ordered the execution being surprised by it. Mark attests the death. Mark also records Pilate's surprise. Those two facts are in the same chapter, in the same verse sequence. The scholarly apparatus that cites Mark as attestation of the death does not, to my knowledge, address the institutional non-engagement with Pilate's surprise in verse 44. And Ehrman's argument does not engage the physical evidence at Rozabal specifically. Not because Ehrman is dishonest, because the question of Rozabal is not a textual question, it is a physical one. You resolve a textual question from a library. You resolve a physical question by sending someone to the site. And in 2,000 years that has not happened. I was at a professional dinner. A former colleague from my teaching years had invited me as part of a small group, 6 people. A Friday evening in late November. The woman sitting across from me was a forensic pathologist, medical examiner's office, 22 years. She was not religious. She had no particular interest in biblical scholarship. She was, as far as I could tell, a person whose professional life consisted entirely of reading bodies for what they could no longer say. Somewhere in the conversation, I mentioned the 6-hour problem. Pilate's surprise. Mark 15, verse 44. She stopped. She looked at me for a second. Then she picked up a pen from the edge of the table. She turned over a paper napkin. She started writing, not words, a timeline. She went through what the gospel accounts record as the physical insults before crucifixion. Scourging with a Roman flagellum, the crown of thorns, puncture wounds to the scalp, being forced to carry a crossbeam on scourged shoulders, nailing through the wrists, nailing through the feet, elevation on the cross for 6 hours in spring heat. She listed the physiological mechanisms that lead to death under those conditions: blood loss, hypovolemic shock, respiratory compromise from the position. She looked up. She said, 6 hours. That is the question. I said, what do you mean? She said, under what specific conditions could someone survive 6 hours of this level of trauma? I am not saying he did. I am saying the medical question requires evidence to answer. Then she said something I have held for years. She said, why has nobody been sent to the tomb? Not the theological question, not what resurrection means, the investigative question, the forensic question. There is a physical site. It has been documented since the 16th century. There are architectural anomalies, there are physical markings. Why has nobody been sent? I did not have an answer. I still do not have a clean one. What I have is this. We have sent forensic teams to sites of lesser historical significance than this. We have carbon-dated relics, excavated Second Temple tombs, run ground-penetrating radar through sites across the Near East and Central Asia. The decision not to investigate the Rozabal shrine is not a failure of technology. It is not a failure of access. The site is in the Khanyar quarter of Old Srinagar. It is not behind a locked vault. It is not in an active war zone. It is on a map. The forensic pathologist asked the right question. Why has nobody been sent? J.J. Benítez spent 40 years documenting what he called the physiological record of the Passion. In Caballo de Troya, and I want to be clear, as I always am, about how I hold his work, his narrators claim to have been present at these events. His methodology operates outside the verification standards that Ehrman or Metzger would apply. I cannot cite his narrator's observations the way I cite a textual scholar or a chronicle. What I find valuable is different from what I find verifiable. And what I find valuable in Benítez's reading of the crucifixion is the question he has been asking for 40 years, not whether Jesus was divine. What do the Gospels physically describe? And does what they physically describe match what we were told it means? Benítez raises the 6-hour question across multiple volumes of the series. He raises the spear wound in John 19. He raises the Joseph of Arimathea intervention, the immediacy of it, the private tomb, the fine linen, the sealed entrance. He describes Joseph's intervention not as a formality of burial, but as something that reads on close examination, like an organized extraction. A man with council connections, who moved within hours, who had the tomb ready, who knew what he was doing. And then Benítez raises the post-resurrection appearances, This is where I want to stay for a moment, because the post-resurrection appearances in the Gospels are, on careful reading, extraordinarily physically specific. John chapter 21. Jesus appears on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. He has built a fire. There is fish on the fire. There is bread. He says, "Come and have breakfast." John records that Jesus took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. He ate. Luke chapter 24. Two disciples on the road to Emmaus. He goes inside with them. He takes the bread, he breaks it, he gives it to them, he handled bread. John chapter 20 verse 27. Thomas refuses to believe unless he can put his finger where the nails were and put his hand into the wounds. Jesus appears. He tells Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." Wounds that could be touched. Wounds that existed in a physical body specific enough for a skeptic to be invited to examine. Benítez's reading of these appearances is not mystical. It is forensic. He argues, and this is the part I keep returning to, that what the Gospels describe in the resurrection appearances is a man with a body. A damaged body. A body with wounds. A body that eats and handles bread and can be touched. Not a ghost, not a vision, not a purely theological construction. A body. The body of a man who had been on a cross for 6 hours, whose bones were intact, unlike the two men beside him whose legs were broken, whose body was claimed immediately by someone with connections to the council, whose tomb was sealed within hours, who disappeared from that tomb within 3 days, and who appeared in Galilee, in Jerusalem on the Emmaus Road, by the Sea of Tiberias, each time physically specific, each time with the wounds. Benítez does not resolve this. Neither do I. What he raises, and what the Gospels raise if you read them as physical documents, is the question of what exactly happened in those 72 hours, and what happens if you follow the trail east. The alley in Khanyar is narrow enough that two people cannot walk side by side. The buildings lean slightly toward each other across the lane, the way old buildings in old cities do, as if they have been talking for so long they have started to angle their faces. The shrine is not marked the way a tourist destination is marked. A small building, modest, the kind of structure that does not announce itself. Inside there is stone flooring, low light. In the floor, set into the stone, are impressions of feet. Local tradition identifies marks in those impressions as wounds. Persian chronicles have documented them since the 18th century. Photographs have been taken. No forensic team from any Western academic institution has ever formally examined them. No ecclesiastical body from any Christian denomination has ever commissioned an analysis. The site is accessible. The address is findable. The documentation is in published chronicles from the 16th and 18th centuries, written by Muslim historians with no Christian agenda. You are standing in an alley in old Srinagar, in front of a small building that has been here for centuries, and the institution that would have the most at stake in what it contains has never sent anyone. Not because they could not find it. The Tarikh-i-Kashmir was written 400 years ago. The Waqiat-i-Kashmir was written nearly 300 years ago. They had 4 centuries to read those chronicles. They sent nobody. That is not an oversight. I want to close with the question that stays with me. Not the question of whether the tomb in Kashmir contains what the local tradition says it contains. I cannot answer that. Nobody can, without going there with the proper equipment and the intention to actually find out. The question that stays with me is simpler. Why has nobody been sent? 2,000 years. The tomb is still there. The chronicles are published. The shrine is accessible. The foot impressions are still in the stone. The burial orientation is still east to west in an Islamic city. The forensic pathologist turned over a napkin and spent 12 minutes with a pen and arrived at the same question that everyone who reads Mark 15:44 carefully arrives at. What specific conditions would allow someone to survive 6 hours of this level of trauma? The only way to answer that question with physical evidence is to examine the only documented tomb in the world that local tradition identifies as belonging to a figure whose name maps linguistically to Jesus, who came from the West, who healed lepers, who is buried in the Jewish direction in an Islamic city, whose feet show marks the tradition identifies as wounds, but nobody has been sent, not by the church, Not by any Christian denomination with the resources to commission a study, not by any secular academic institution with the ability to secure access. And here is what I have arrived at, after years with this question. The most dangerous finding is not what the tomb might contain. The most dangerous finding is what the institutional non-investigation implies. If the tomb is empty, if the tradition is a linguistic coincidence, a local legend, a 16th century error that has nothing to do with the Jesus of Galilee, then an investigation confirms the resurrection narrative. It becomes the strongest possible defense of the tradition. You go, you look, you find nothing. And you come back with evidence that the story is secure. That would happen if the non-investigation were about logistics. But it is not about logistics. It is about what happens if someone goes and finds something, not proof. Not a document with a name written in Aramaic, just anomalies, physical anomalies in a documented site that raise more questions than the institution is prepared to publicly answer. The non-investigation is not an absence. It is a choice, made continuously for 400 years since the chronicles were first written, and the choice tells you something that no document in a restricted vault could tell you. It tells you what the institution calculates it has to lose. 2,000 years. The tomb is still there. The chronicles are published. The shrine is on a map. The forensic pathologist's question is written on a napkin somewhere, and nobody has been sent. Read the silence. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels.